It was supposed to be a joyful evening, a family party filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and old songs. Everyone was smiling, pretending that love still held us together. I sat in the corner, quiet, watching faces that once felt familiar. But happiness can hide cruelty when you look long enough. Between the music and the noise, I heard my son's voice, low, casual, but sharp enough to cut through everything. She can't live forever. The room went cold. I didn't speak, didn't move. In that single moment, I knew what my next move would be. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and listen closely, because some truths are written in silence. The night had started like any other family gathering. Too much food, too many smiles, and not enough sincerity. I sat quietly near the hallway, away from the noise, holding a small plate I barely touched. The laughter came and went like waves, loud and hollow. My son moved around the room, refilling glasses, laughing with his wife, talking about money, plans, and holidays. He looked like a man proud of his success, but I had long stopped recognizing the person behind that smile. It wasn't the same boy I raised, the one who once saved coins to buy me birthday flowers. Success had changed him, or maybe greed had. As I sat there, I heard him near the kitchen. His voice carried easily over the music. He was speaking to a cousin, pretending to joke, but his tone wasn't playful. "She can't live forever," he said, half laughing, half serious. "Once she's gone, we'll finally have space to make it ours." A few others chuckled, maybe to ease the discomfort, maybe because they didn't know what else to do. But I heard it differently. Not as a joke, not as harmless talk. I heard the truth, raw, cruel, and spoken without shame. My heart didn't break. It hardened. In that moment, the sound around me faded. The music stopped mattering. The chatter blurred into a distant hum. I watched my son from across the room, his face lit by the chandelier. He looked happy, relaxed even, like a man making plans for a life already half his. But he wasn't planning a future with me. He was planning a future after me. Every smile he gave that night, every polite gesture, every, "Are you all right, Mum?" I saw it all for what it was, a waiting game. I excused myself quietly and walked to the washroom. I locked the door, stood by the mirror, and looked at myself. My reflection didn't look shocked or broken. It looked calm. Older than I remembered, yes. Tired eyes, thinner face, but calm. I'd lived too long to be surprised by selfishness. But hearing it from your own child changes something deep inside. It doesn't just hurt. It rearranges how you see the world. That night, in that mirror, I realized that love doesn't always blind you. Sometimes it sharpens your sight. When I walked back out, I moved differently. I watched everything, carefully. Who spoke to whom? Who avoided my gaze? Who glanced toward the end of the hallway where the family photos hung? I noticed small things I had ignored before. The way my daughter-in-law held her wine and smiled whenever my son mentioned the house. The way he said, "our home," instead of "Mum's home." Those details built a picture, clearer than any confession could. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were counting on it. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I smiled when I needed to. I nodded when they spoke. But my mind was no longer at that party. It was in my desk drawer, where I kept my documents. My will, my property deeds, my accounts. I thought about every decision I had ever made, every gift, every favor, and I realized something. Kindness without caution had made me easy to exploit. I had handed over power, one signature at a time, thinking it was love. It wasn't. It was carelessness, dressed as generosity. When the party ended, my son kissed my cheek and said he'd visit soon. His wife smiled, the same empty smile she always wore when she wanted something. I nodded, thanked them for the evening, and closed the door behind them. The house felt colder, heavier. I stood in the dark for a long time, my hand resting on the table, listening to the faint ticking of the clock. She can't live forever. The words repeated in my head, over and over, not as pain, but as purpose. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't pray for change. I made a decision. If they were planning for my end, I would plan for their surprise. Not through anger, not through confrontation, but through quiet, deliberate action. The kind they would never see coming. I went to bed, knowing that when the morning came, my house, my life, and my legacy would begin to change hands. But not into theirs. My story didn't begin with betrayal. It began with hard work. Years of it. My husband and I built our life piece by piece, never fast, never fancy, just steady. He worked long hours at the factory, and I managed the home, the children, and the bills. Every decision we made was for the future, their future. When we bought the house, it wasn't big, but it was solid. The walls held laughter, arguments, birthdays, and the sound of small feet running through the hallway. We called it ours, but in truth, I always thought of it as theirs. Everything I saved, everything I endured, was meant to make their lives easier when I was gone. When my husband passed, it felt like the world collapsed inward. The silence that followed was unbearable. My son was there then, kind, helpful, saying all the right things. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll look after everything." And I believed him. I believed every word because I wanted to. Grief makes you trust too quickly, and I handed him responsibilities without hesitation. The business shares, the house maintenance, the accounts, all fell into his hands. I didn't question his choices. I thought, he's my son. What could go wrong? Years passed, and I watched him build a life of comfort. He married a woman who loved luxury more than loyalty. Still, I welcomed her. I wanted to believe she would bring happiness into his life, even if her smile didn't reach her eyes. My daughter moved abroad for work, visiting less and less, so he became the one I depended on. Not for care, but for companionship. He called every few days, helped with errands, kept the appearance of a good son. But beneath that surface, something had changed. It began subtly. When I'd ask about the business, he'd say, "It's fine, Mom. You don't need to worry." When I'd mention household expenses, he'd say, "Let me handle it." And so I did. I let him handle everything because it was easier, because I was tired, because I wanted to trust him. But now I realize that was the beginning of invisibility. Slowly, my name started disappearing. From conversations, from papers, from ownership. I didn't see it happening. Betrayal rarely knocks loudly. It creeps in quietly while you're still calling it love. When my husband died, I told myself the house would always be my anchor. I kept it spotless. Every Sunday, I'd polish the furniture, dust the shelves, and sit by the window remembering him. The garden he planted still bloomed every spring, and that gave me strength. But while I tended to the roses, my son was tending to his own plans, ones I didn't see until much later. That family party where I heard his words wasn't just a random event. It was the result of years of small changes, unnoticed details, and blind faith. I should have seen it sooner. The new car, the expensive trips, the quiet conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I thought I was imagining things. I thought getting older meant I was becoming paranoid, but I wasn't. I was simply surrounded by people who mistook my kindness for weakness. It's strange how life works. You spend decades building something for your children, not just a home, but a legacy. You sacrifice your time, your energy, and your health so they can have stability. And then one day you realize they see that same stability as their entitlement. My husband used to say, "We're building roots." I see now that some roots rot if you stop checking where they spread. Everything I had, the business shares, the savings, the property, existed because of both of us, not just me. And when he passed, it should have remained a shared memory. But my son didn't see legacy. He saw opportunity. The love that once made him protective turned into ambition. I thought I was passing down security. What I was really handing over was control. By the time that family party came, I had already given him too much trust. But hearing those words, "She can't live forever," woke something in me that had been asleep for too long. The woman who had built everything had returned, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even her own blood, decide the end of her story. From that moment on, my love became logic. My heart stopped hoping, and my hands started preparing. The time for blind trust was over. The time for quiet correction had begun. The change didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, like dust settling in corners you forget to clean. After my husband's death, my son visited often, bringing groceries, helping fix things, checking on me. It was comforting at first. But as years passed, the warmth in his visits faded. He came less for conversation, more for control. The excuses started small. Busy week, work stress, traffic. Soon his visits became appointments, his tone colder, his time shorter. What once felt like family turned into formality. I used to wait by the window watching his car pull into the driveway. Now I watched the clock and wondered if he'd remember at all. When he did come, he brought his wife, who always looked around the house like she was taking inventory. Her compliments sounded rehearsed. "What a beautiful home. You've kept it so nice." Each word carried the same silent message. "It'll be ours someday." I told myself I was overthinking, that age was making me suspicious. But my gut knew better. Then came the talks about future plans. They started casually over tea. My son would say things like, "You shouldn't live alone, Mom. It's not safe." Or, "Maybe we could renovate, make the place more modern." At first, it sounded like care, but soon, we became they. He spoke as if the house already belonged to them, as if my life was a temporary lease he was waiting to end. Every conversation about safety or comfort felt less about me and more about convenience. When I mentioned hiring help, he frowned. "No need for that. We'll manage everything." Yet, he didn't. The repairs slowed down. Bills went unpaid. I'd find lights flickering, the garden overgrown, small things left undone. I realized it wasn't neglect by accident, it was neglect by design. He wanted the place to feel heavy, old, unmanageable. The message was clear. "You're getting too old for this, Mom." The distance grew in other ways, too. Calls became short. Birthdays turned into text messages. He'd speak about investments, plans for his future, holidays abroad. I listened quietly, knowing my presence had become background noise in his grander life. My daughter-in-law's smile tightened each time I mentioned my will. "Oh, you don't need to worry about that yet," she'd say, pretending concern. But her eyes betrayed her. They were always calculating. Then came the party, the one that changed everything. That gathering wasn't a celebration. It was a performance. Everyone seemed overly cheerful, forcing laughter that didn't reach their eyes. My son kept mentioning family legacy, responsibility, and new beginnings. Each phrase felt heavier than the last. I realized that while I sat there, they were already planning life after me. Not with grief, but with excitement. It was a celebration of what they thought was coming, not what was lost. In that moment, I understood why I had been feeling invisible. I wasn't part of their present anymore. I was part of their future plan. And the thought that my son could smile while waiting for my life to end didn't fill me with anger. It filled me with clarity. The next morning, the house felt quieter than usual. Dust floated in the sunlight, and the photos on the wall seemed to look back at me. My husband smiling, my children young and innocent. I stood there thinking about how everything we built had turned into a countdown. It wasn't just about the house, it was about respect. And once that's gone, the rest follows. From that day, I stopped waiting for kindness. I stopped hoping for gratitude. I stopped expecting my son to remember who raised him, because I finally understood something vital. Love without respect is not love at all. It's possession disguised as affection. So, I did what I had to do, quietly, without a word to anyone. While they kept waiting for me to fade away, I was already rewriting the ending they didn't expect. That night after the party, I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair near the window, listening to the wind brush against the curtains. My mind replayed every word, every glance, every hidden meaning from that evening. She can't live forever. It looped in my head like a curse I refused to accept. I had spent a lifetime building everything they now took for granted, and they had already decided where it would all go when I was gone. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't gone yet. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't confront anyone. I had done those things before in life, and they never solved anything. This time, I would not waste a single tear on betrayal. I realized that when people show you their true intentions, it's not a tragedy. It's an opportunity. I had just been handed a chance to reclaim my life before it was stolen. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the old metal box that held the most important documents of my life. Property deeds, insurance papers, my husband's will, and the trust we had built together. I spread everything across the bed and read through them carefully, line by line, as though I were reading a stranger's story. Years of signatures, stamps, and dates lay in front of me. Everything we owned, everything I still protected, was in my name. My son had no idea that legally, nothing transferred to him automatically. That night, I decided it never would. I thought back to something my husband once said when we were struggling to pay the mortgage. "You can lose money and still recover," he told me. "But once you lose control, you lose everything." He was right. I had been so focused on love and family that I had forgotten the one rule he lived by. Always protect what's yours, even from those you love. The next morning, before sunrise, I dressed neatly and left the house without telling anyone. I didn't need their permission anymore. My steps were slow but steady as I made my way to the solicitor's office, the same one that had helped us buy our home decades ago. I hadn't been there in years, but walking into that building felt like taking back a piece of myself. The receptionist recognized me immediately, and when my solicitor came out to greet me, I could tell he sensed something serious. We sat down in his office, surrounded by shelves of files and the smell of old paper. I told him I needed to make changes. Quiet ones. I wanted to revise my will, update ownership titles, and secure my assets so they couldn't be touched or sold without my written approval. No transfers, no shared signatures, no loopholes. I explained that I wasn't angry. I was simply ready to protect what I had earned. He nodded, saying only, "You're doing the right thing, Mrs. Clark." Over the next few hours, we went through every detail. I moved my house into a private trust under my name, appointing a neutral trustee instead of a family member. I revised my will so that charitable organizations, the same ones that had helped my husband's clinic years ago, would receive the estate after my passing. My son and his wife were removed entirely. The solicitor ensured every document was signed, sealed, and filed that same day. When it was done, I felt lighter. There was no drama, no revenge speech, no emotional outburst. Just quiet action. Real power isn't loud. It's calm, measured, and final. When I returned home that afternoon, my son was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up as I walked in. I smiled faintly, placed my bag on the table, and went straight to my room. He didn't know it yet, but the very house he was sitting in no longer belonged to him. Not now, not ever. That evening, as I made myself a cup of tea, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. For the first time in years, I saw strength instead of sadness. I realized I didn't need to wait for respect. I could command it, even in silence. The decision I made that day wasn't born out of hatred. It was born out of self-respect. They might have laughed that night, thinking I was too old to matter. But the truth was simple. I still held the pen, and I had just rewritten the story. They thought they were counting down my days. What they didn't know was that I had already ended their chapter in mine. After that decision, life went on as if nothing had changed. I still smiled when my son visited, still made tea when my daughter-in-law came over pretending to care. On the surface, everything looked the same. But beneath it, I was quietly closing every door they thought they could walk through. My movements became deliberate, my tone measured. I wasn't their victim anymore. I was their observer. Every morning, I started with routine: breakfast, light cleaning, a walk around the garden. But now, I used that time to think clearly. Every errand became part of my preparation. I visited the bank twice a week under the excuse of sorting old accounts. I transferred savings into my private account, one they didn't know existed. I requested paper statements only, no emails. I withdrew small amounts of cash and stored it discreetly. It wasn't fear guiding me anymore. It was clarity. I knew now how easy it was for people to smile at you while slowly taking everything you've worked for. I also visited my solicitor again to complete the next step. Together, we made copies of the trust documents and stored them in 2 separate places, one at his office, one in a private deposit box. I wanted no room for misplacement. He assured me that legally the property was sealed. Even if someone tried to challenge it, they would face years of legal blockades. That gave me peace. I had turned my vulnerability into armor. I began reviewing my bills and subscriptions next. My son used to manage them, but not anymore. I called each service provider personally, changed contact details, and removed his name from every record. The process was tiring, but with every completed call, I felt stronger. Power doesn't come from shouting. It comes from signing your own name again. At home, I kept up appearances. I knew I couldn't reveal my plan too early. So when they talked about renovating the house or helping me downsize, I nodded politely. I let them believe I was still dependent, still naive, still trusting. I even pretended to forget things occasionally, so they wouldn't suspect how sharp my mind truly was. You learn a lot by pretending not to notice. One afternoon, while they sat in my living room discussing their future goals, I quietly looked around. The furniture I'd polished for decades, the family photos on the wall, the old clock my husband loved, they all had stories of sacrifice. I realized then that revenge doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes, revenge means preservation, keeping what's yours from being rewritten by those who never earned it. At night, I wrote everything down in a small notebook I kept hidden in my sewing drawer. Not emotional words, just facts. Dates, transactions, conversations, promises. Every detail that could matter later. It became my quiet record of truth, one that no one else knew existed. My daughter called one evening from abroad and said, "Mum, you sound stronger." She didn't know how true that was. I wasn't just stronger. I was prepared. For the first time in years, I was living with purpose again, not just existing in the shadow of my own generosity. Weeks passed, and my son began to notice that I wasn't as open anymore. He'd ask questions, subtle ones. "Did you sort your will yet? Do you still want me to handle the insurance?" I answered simply, "It's all taken care of." That was the truth. It just wasn't taken care of by him anymore. Every signature, every quiet visit, every sealed envelope was my way of reclaiming control. I didn't need to expose him yet, not while he still believed he had time. Because the most powerful kind of justice is the one that happens without noise. When the people who planned your downfall realize too late that they were never in control. The day I finished the last piece of paperwork, I placed all the updated copies in a plain brown folder. On the front, I wrote 2 words in neat handwriting: my peace. I slid it into the drawer beside my husband's photo and smiled faintly. They thought I was growing weaker, but I was only growing quieter. And quiet doesn't mean powerless. Quiet means prepared. Pretending became my quiet strategy. I realized that sometimes survival isn't about confrontation, it's about observation. After securing everything legally, I knew I couldn't reveal my strength too soon. If they suspected what I had done, they'd start fighting back, trying to manipulate or guilt me. So I decided to play the same part they believed I'd always been: the fragile, aging woman who needed their guidance. When my son and daughter-in-law visited, I greeted them with warmth and calm. I let them believe I was dependent on their help. I asked simple questions about groceries and bills, as if I still needed them to handle things. Each time they explained something to me slowly, with fake patience, I smiled politely and thanked them. Inside, I was noting every word, every glance they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. I learned that silence unsettles people who expect weakness. They kept trying to test control. My son would ask, "Do you remember where you keep the insurance papers?" Or, "Do you want me to look at the house taxes?" I'd answer with soft confusion, saying, "Oh, yes," somewhere around. They didn't know that everything had already been transferred, sealed, and locked under my name alone. When family dinners came, I sat quietly and let them lead conversations. They spoke about vacations, renovations, and their future plans for the property. My daughter-in-law once said, "We'll have to modernize things once we move in," and everyone laughed. I joined in too. My laugh wasn't out of amusement. It was power hidden behind politeness. They had no idea that the very home they joked about owning was legally out of their reach forever. Keeping up appearances wasn't easy. It required patience and control. Every time I heard them talk about the future, my chest tightened, but I refused to show emotion. Emotion feeds manipulators. Silence starves them. I became invisible on purpose, the kind of quiet they couldn't predict. In public, I kept my image intact. I continued, volunteering at the church, hosting small gatherings with neighbors, and visiting the community center. Everyone still saw me as the kind, gentle widow, unaware that behind my soft smiles was a woman building a wall of protection around her life. Even my closest friends didn't know about the trust documents. The fewer people who knew, the stronger my control stayed. Weeks later, my son began dropping hints again. "Mum, maybe it's time to think about moving somewhere smaller," he'd suggest. I agreed in words, but never in action. I wanted to see how far he'd go. Soon, he brought pamphlets for retirement homes. I thanked him, tucked them in a drawer, and never looked at them again. His tone began to change after that, a little sharper, more impatient. I could tell he was frustrated that I wasn't following his plan. But I never argued. I never explained. I simply nodded and smiled, letting him drown in his own assumptions. That was my quiet revenge, letting him believe he was still ahead while he was already losing everything. I kept the same composure when my daughter-in-law visited. She tried to talk sweetly, often bringing small gifts like scarves or biscuits, hoping to win favor. But her kindness had calculation behind it. She'd glance around the rooms, asking innocent questions about antiques or heirlooms. I gave her vague answers and watched how her eyes followed every expensive piece. She thought she was being clever. She didn't realize she was confirming everything I already knew. Every evening, after they left, I sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea and replayed the day. I thought about how easily love can turn into greed when people stop being grateful. My house, once full of laughter, now echoed with lessons. Quiet, harsh, unforgettable lessons. Keeping up the performance was exhausting, but necessary. You can't expose betrayal too early. You must let it believe it's winning. That's the only way to make justice hit where it hurts. In pride, not possessions. Months passed, and I remained patient. I smiled when they bragged, agreed when they planned, and stayed calm when they hinted. All while knowing one simple truth. The signatures that mattered were already mine. They just didn't know it yet. One night, as I locked my bedroom door, I whispered to myself, "Let them laugh. Let them dream. They're building a castle on sand." And in that silence, I realized something powerful. Pretending can be its own form of justice. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I remember because it was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that always comes before something changes. I was pruning the roses in my garden when the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. A polite voice introduced himself as an estate agent, saying he was calling to confirm the ownership details for my property. He said my son had contacted their office to list the house for sale. I stood there, frozen, listening to every word. My own son, who still visited every Sunday for tea, was now trying to sell the roof over my head. I didn't argue or panic. Instead, I asked the agent kindly to email me the details of the listing. He agreed and sent them within minutes. I opened my laptop, and there it was, my home, my garden, my life, all described as a promising redevelopment opportunity. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere. The contact was my son's. I sat back in my chair, calm and cold. The game was over. It was time to show them what I had been preparing for. That evening, I called my solicitor. I told him to prepare the trust deed copies and schedule a meeting for the next day. I also printed the email from the estate agent and placed it neatly inside a file. Every step I took was quiet, calculated, and final. The next morning, I dressed neatly, wore my pearls, and went to the agent's office in person. When I introduced myself, the staff looked surprised. I told them politely that there must have been a misunderstanding. This property wasn't for sale because it wasn't owned by the man who listed it. I handed them the trust documents and pointed to my name. Sole beneficiary, lifetime occupant, irrevocable clause. The agent's expression changed from confusion to shock. He excused himself and went into the back office to make calls. Within half an hour, my son arrived, his face pale, his voice shaking between anger and embarrassment. He tried to act composed, but I could see the panic behind his eyes. He asked me what I was doing there. I didn't respond. I didn't owe him words. The truth was already speaking for me through the papers I held. The agent placed both documents on the table, my trust deed and my son's fraudulent listing form. My signature was the only legal one in the room. The agent looked at him and said quietly, "We can't proceed with the sale. This property is under a binding trust. It's not yours to sell." For a moment, my son's mask fell completely. He looked smaller, like a child who had just realized the game was over. His confidence dissolved, and all that remained was shock. I didn't feel pity. Pity is a luxury you lose when betrayal comes from your own blood. He tried to speak, but I stood up slowly and gathered the papers. I looked him in the eye and said, "You wanted to plan my end, but I already planned my peace." Then I walked out, leaving him standing there with his unfulfilled greed. That night, the phone rang several times, but I didn't answer. There were messages from him and his wife, excuses, apologies, half-hearted justifications. I deleted them all. When someone shows you what your love is worth to them, you don't negotiate. You accept, you adjust, and you move forward. Days later, word spread through the family that there had been a misunderstanding. My relatives called, curious. I told them calmly, "There's no misunderstanding, only correction." That was all they needed to know. I didn't owe anyone the full story. What mattered was that my home was safe, my name was intact, and my silence had done what shouting never could. In the weeks that followed, I walked through every room of my house with a new sense of peace. The same walls that once felt heavy with worry now felt lighter, stronger. My son stopped visiting. His laughter no longer echoed through the rooms, and that was fine. Some silences are healthier than forced company. He thought I was too weak to fight back. What he didn't understand was that strength doesn't always come with volume. Sometimes strength looks like a smile at a dinner table, a steady hand signing papers, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the people who wish to outlive you will never outsmart you. The day I walked into that estate office, I didn't just protect my home. I ended a story they had written without my permission. And in doing so, I wrote my own ending. One signed, sealed, and untouchable. After that day, everything changed. Not loudly, but completely. The phone stopped ringing. The visits stopped. The laughter that once filled the hallway became an echo I could only hear in memory. My son had gone quiet. The silence between us grew larger than any argument ever could. But I didn't chase him. I'd already spent too many years chasing respect that never came. At first, there were attempts, small, careful messages. "Mom, we should talk. Mom, it was a misunderstanding. Mom, please answer. Each one shorter than the last until the tone shifted from guilt to blame. He said I had embarrassed him, that I'd overreacted. I read them all and said nothing. There's no use arguing with someone who only speaks to protect themselves. The daughter-in-law's messages came next. Long, emotional paragraphs about family unity and forgiveness. She mentioned how hard it was on my son, how everyone was talking. I noticed she never once used the words sorry or truth. That told me everything I needed to know. Some people want reconciliation, not because they regret what they did, but because they regret getting caught. Days turned into weeks, and the silence became routine. At first, I caught myself waiting for an apology, a visit, something human. But nothing came, and strangely, I started to feel lighter. My mornings were peaceful again. No more pretending, no more tension. I could walk through my home without feeling watched. I could breathe without the weight of distrust pressing on my chest. Neighbors noticed, of course. One of them asked why my son hadn't been around lately. I simply said, "He's busy." It wasn't a lie. He was busy learning the difference between entitlement and consequence. I owed no one the full story. My dignity didn't need an audience. The daughter-in-law tried once more to call. I let it ring. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. Thick paper, careful, handwriting. I recognized my son's writing immediately. For a long time, I didn't open it. It sat on my table for 2 full days, staring back at me. When I finally unfolded it, it wasn't what I expected. No confession, no acceptance, just a list of reasons, excuses dressed as explanations. He blamed stress, bad advice, miscommunication. But the line that stayed with me was this: I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just planning for the future. That was the truth in its ugliest form. He wasn't planning for the future. He was planning around me, as if I was just another obstacle to outlive. I folded the letter, placed it back in its envelope, and slid it into the drawer with my old documents. It became evidence of a lesson, not a memory. In time, the family began to whisper. Cousins stopped calling. Relatives picked sides. Most quietly leaned toward him, thinking I was being dramatic. That's fine. People always defend the version of the story that's easiest to believe. But I didn't defend myself. I'd already defended my life once, through paperwork and preparation. The rest didn't matter. Months passed, and the seasons changed. The garden bloomed again. The quiet became my companion, not my punishment. Some nights, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring at the streetlights. I thought of my husband, and how proud he'd be that I'd finally learned to protect what we built. He always said, "Don't expect gratitude for doing the right thing." Now I understood what he meant. My son and I never spoke again after that. I didn't block him. I didn't reach out. I simply allowed the silence to finish what truth had started. Sometimes love has to die so that peace can live. I started donating small portions of my savings to community causes. I visited the local orphanage every week, reading to children who listened with genuine warmth. They reminded me that love, when given freely, still exists somewhere, even if it doesn't come from your own blood. When people asked if I missed my son, I said, "No, I miss the version of him that used to love me." That was the difference. He existed, but the person I raised did not. The man who replaced him was someone else entirely, and that person wasn't welcome here anymore. In that silence, I found peace. Not the kind that comes from reconciliation, but the kind that comes from finality, the kind that says you hurt me once, but you'll never get the chance again. And so I carried on, alone but not lonely. I realized that distance isn't punishment, it's protection. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, like morning light sneaking through curtains after a long night. For months, I had lived in a quiet house, one stripped of arguments, expectations, and false smiles. At first, that silence felt heavy, like a reminder of loss. But as time passed, it turned into something softer. It became freedom. I started every morning with a new ritual. Instead of waiting for messages that would never come, I made tea and sat in my garden. The air smelled clean, and the sound of birds replaced the voices that once filled my home with tension. I began tending the flowers myself again. Roses, lilies, and a small patch of lavender near the fence. Gardening became more than a hobby. It became proof that life still grows after betrayal. Each time I cut dead leaves away, I thought about my son. How some things have to be removed completely before beauty can return. I began to reclaim my house, one room at a time. I took down the family photos that once felt like memories and replaced them with landscapes. Quiet oceans, open skies, places untouched by lies. The living room that used to host shallow conversations now held warmth again. I moved my husband's old chair to the window where the sunlight hit just right in the afternoons. Sitting there, I could almost hear his calm voice telling me I'd done the right thing. He would have been proud, not because I fought, but because I fought without losing my grace. I stopped keeping track of my son's life. I no longer asked neighbors if they'd seen him or wondered if he'd ever visit. I realized that freedom doesn't mean forgetting someone. It means accepting that they no longer deserve space in your thoughts. I didn't erase him. I just stopped carrying him with me. My energy shifted toward something new. I started volunteering at the community library. Twice a week, I read to children who listened with wide eyes and honest hearts. Their laughter filled the silence that used to feel unbearable. They didn't know my story, and that made their kindness pure. When they hugged me at the end of story time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Usefulness. The money I once saved for family emergencies went to causes that truly helped families. Scholarships, food drives, small grants for single mothers. Every donation I made was a quiet act of healing. The same money my son once saw as inheritance became a bridge for strangers who would never betray me. I didn't need to punish him anymore. My peace was punishment enough. The neighbors began noticing changes too. They'd pass by and see me painting the garden fence or laughing with the children who visited to help with chores. Some even said, "You look 10 years younger." I smiled and said, "That's what happens when you stop waiting for apologies." There were moments when loneliness tried to return. Some nights, I'd walk past the closed door of my son's old room and feel that small sting of what could have been. But I learned not to stay there. Regret is like quicksand. If you stop moving, it pulls you under. Instead, I kept walking, lighting a candle in the hallway before bed, reminding myself that light doesn't ask permission to shine again. Peace didn't mean perfection. It meant control. Quiet, steady control over what entered my mind and heart. The house was smaller now, not in space, but in noise. Every sound had meaning again. The clock ticking, the kettle boiling, the soft hum of the fridge. Ordinary sounds, once drowned out by chaos, became music. I understood finally that love doesn't always last a lifetime, but dignity can. I lost a son, but I found myself. I rebuilt my world brick by brick, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. My peace wasn't born from victory, it was born from closure. Sometimes people think revenge means destruction, but mine was different. My revenge was living, eating well, sleeping deeply, laughing again. It was making my home beautiful, while they wondered why theirs no longer felt like one. I no longer looked at the past with anger. Instead, I saw it as proof. Proof that even after betrayal, a heart can learn to beat quietly, calmly, and without fear. And as I sat in my garden one evening, the sky turning gold, I realized something simple, yet powerful. I didn't need anyone to understand my peace. It was mine alone, earned, protected, and finally, complete. It's strange how quiet life becomes after the storm passes. I sit most mornings on my porch now, watching the light move across the garden. The same garden that once heard every argument, every promise, every disappointment. The air feels cleaner, lighter, like the house itself exhaled after years of holding its breath. I think about what happened sometimes, but not with pain anymore, with understanding. People often believe revenge is about punishment, but they're wrong. Revenge is clarity. It's that sharp, quiet moment when you finally see people for who they truly are and decide never to hand them another weapon. My son gave me one final gift without knowing it: the truth. And truth, though painful, is far kinder than lies wrapped in affection. I realize now that all my life I mistook responsibility for love. I thought raising, helping, and forgiving endlessly would make my son respect me. But some people don't learn gratitude. They learn dependence. The more you give, the more they take, until generosity becomes a weakness they exploit. That lesson came late, but not too late. If I hadn't returned home early that day, if I hadn't overheard the laughter that wasn't meant for my ears, I might still be living blind. I might have died thinking love meant surrender. But betrayal opened my eyes. It reminded me that protection isn't selfishness. It's survival. Now I live differently. I protect my peace the way I once protected my family. I no longer wait for calls or visits. I no longer measure my worth through anyone's approval. I have my garden, my books, and my silence. The three things that never lied to me. I've learned that family is not defined by blood. Blood gives life, but respect sustains it. When either runs dry, you move on. My son chose greed over gratitude. I chose peace over pain. We both got what we deserved. Some nights, neighbors stop by to share tea or stories. They often ask how I can stay so calm after everything. I tell them, because I stopped expecting apologies from people who aren't sorry. Forgiveness is overrated when it costs your dignity. I didn't need to forgive him to move on. I just needed to release the part of myself that still wanted him to understand. What I've learned is simple. Closure doesn't always come from reconciliation. It comes from self-respect. It's the moment you stop asking why and start saying never again. I sometimes think about that night at the party. His voice saying, "She can't live forever." He meant it as a joke, but jokes are often truth in disguise. That sentence, careless and cruel, became the turning point of my life. It reminded me that I couldn't control how long I lived, but I could control how I lived and who benefited from it. Today, the house stands firm, not as a monument of what I lost, but of what I reclaimed. It shelters only peace now, No manipulation, no schemes, no whispered plans of inheritance. I walk through it freely, knowing every corner belongs to me because I earned it, not because anyone granted permission. To those who've been betrayed by their own blood, I'll say this: betrayal doesn't destroy you. It introduces you to yourself. The woman I am now, calm, steady, unbothered, is someone I wouldn't have met without heartbreak. I thank life for the lesson, even if it came cruelly. Sometimes I wonder if my son ever regrets it. The words, the greed, the silence that followed. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But regret changes nothing when respect is already buried. I've buried enough to know when not to dig anymore. Now I end every day the same way. Sitting in my garden, watching the sunset. I don't count what I've lost. I count what I've kept. My peace, my home, my name. All mine, all earned. And if I could speak to anyone watching this now, I'd ask you one thing. If you ever overheard someone you love planning your absence, what would you do? Would you break down quietly, pretending you didn't hear? Or would you do what I did? Stand up, sign your peace into permanence, and let them learn that a mother may age, but her strength doesn't die with her patience? Because I heard him say, she can't live forever. And I didn't. I lived smarter instead.